Okay. Obviously, if you saw the title, that it is a play on words. HaKol B'Seder means that everything's okay, and that is the point also. But we're also preparing for Pesach, and the Seder at HaKol B'Seder means it's all in the Seder. It's all in there. The Haggadah is not just a guide to a wonderful evening of reminiscing of the things that Hashem did for us and the glorious redemption that we experienced back at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, and all the things that happened, and going back in history. It's also a history lesson, going back to our origins, somewhat, not that much detail. And then, of course, all the activities and the Arba Kashriyos, the four questions, and all the fun things that we do, and the delicious foods that we enjoy. It's tremendous, even though it's accumulative, even though it wasn't all done at one time, and people added to it as time went on, but as was necessary, as was seen fit. But it's also a guide to Geula. That's really what it's meant to be. Because even though we celebrate Yetzias Mitzrayim, meaning that we went out from the Exodus from Egypt, it's a work in progress. We didn't complete the job as only initial stage. All the Jewish people did not leave at that time. Four-fifths remained behind in Mitzrayim, died in Mitzrayim, in Makas Choshech, and the rest, floundered in the desert, and we never got it right. And we got there's Canaan. It's always been like only a partial redemption, and that's why there's only one mention, because Galus Babel and Galus Medai and Yavin and even Edom, which is the longest of all, are subsets of Galus Mitzrayim, and therefore Gul Mitzrayim. And so the final redemption is really just the completion of the first redemption, as mentioned many times in the past, that Kates Hayamim, which is the official title of the end of days, Kates, the end, Hayamim are those days, right? What do you mean those days? End of days, that's all I have to say. That's what people say in general, but Hebrew is Kates Hayamim, which means the end of the days, which means, specific days. And which specific days? Well, the ones that were not completed when we left Mitzrayim, because even though, according to the Rizal, we really only were supposed to be there lachachila for 210 years based upon Kabbalah, because the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Ekia, which is the one that Moshe says, whom should I say is calling? When I go down to Mitzrayim to get the Jewish people out, they're going to want to know your names. So Hashem said Ekia, and the Gematria of Ekia 21 corresponds to 11 the spheres, and each of these spheres have 10 of their own spheres, so 10 times 21 is 210 that had to be completed. Sharp psukim. You can see it for yourself inside the Kabbalah behind it. But nonetheless, 400 years were predicted, were prophesied, given over to Avram Avinu in Bris and Besarim, and whatever that means. And Rashi does a cheshbon to show how it's true, even if we left Egypt after only 210 years, leaving hanging 190 years. And you can see we're not complete. You can see it's really an immature level of Klal Yisrael, of Knesset Yisrael. It's the ultimate state of the Jewish people, is Knesset Yisrael, and we're just starting out. We're just young. We're new at this, and we're just becoming a nation. We became a nation in Mitzrayim. The first person to ever call us an was Paro in Parashat Shmos, and it's called Kura Barzel. It's called the Iron Furnace because that's the place we were molded into a nation. But bottom line is that even though we left after 210 years, it was not really Geulas Mitzrayim. Galus Mitzrayim it was, but as Haggadah says, everybody has to look at themselves as if they too left Egypt, because everybody is leaving Egypt. Egypt, if by now you didn't get it, we've mentioned this also a lot of times, that Mitzrayim is a conceptual reality. We're used to calling it Egypt because that's what it was called. Look at a Hebrew atlas, and it says Mitzrayim, because that's the biblical name for it, and it's stuck all this time. But the reality is Mitzrayim is a conceptual exile. It's more of the concept of Meitzer Yam, confining the Nun Shari Bina, the 50 gates of understanding, the basis of Torah and Das, and all these things that connect us to God and allow us to become completed and to perfect creation. And simply put, being secular is the opposite. Being hedonistic is the opposite. And some people are really extreme in that respect. The Greeks, for example, were very extreme in that respect, right? But others are about. We all have a certain amount of hedonism in us, either due to the fact that we have Yetzer Hara, that's first and foremost, and after that, then the culture that we live in and how much it supports that Yetzer Hara. But we're all leaving Mitzrayim, and it was always meant to be that the final departure from Mitzrayim completely, not just Egypt, but Mitzrayim, is going to be through Mashiach ben David at the end of history. Even Mashiach ben Yosef is only there to pave the way for Mashiach ben David in order to be able to go out finally completely from Mitzrayim, meaning from that way of thinking, from that approach to life. And that will, of course, usher in the Messianic era, which is when Hashem HaKadosh Baruch Hu will shech the Yetzer Hara and mimale the olam with deya, with das, and then of course there'll be no Yetzer Hara and no paro, because paro and the Yetzer Hara are one of the same things. But the point is the Haggadah. It's man cheresenu. That's what we call Pesach. It's man cheresenu. Not just back then. In every generation, it's man cheres. It's a chance to go free, and you can do the Seder, and people do it. They have their way of doing it, and and reading the words and going through the whole thing, and it's exciting in its own right. But the actual experience of cherus is at a completely different level altogether. The actual process of going free is something that most people do not even understand how to do, even through the Haggadah, and don't do it. As a result of that, we don't change much after Pesach, except for the fact we may have gained some more weight, right? But some people might have lost some weight if they don't like matzah. And once upon a time, there was a lot less food. Today, you can eat to your heart's content, and it's not what the Torah had in mind. It's not what Chazal had in mind, but HaKol B'Seder. It's all in the Seder. The Seder stuff, you take it apart piece by piece, and not just to plug my own Haggadah, which I did last year, which you can get on Amazon. That's basically what I've done. And through the Haggadah itself, I tried to point out the different places where it's offering an opportunity for a person to use the material, use the ideas, use the experience to go to a whole different level altogether, and hopefully for good, and make that change and experience freedom at a much higher level of everyday experience. But the other idea of HaKol B'Seder is the fact that even though the situation seems to be somewhat dire, it's not World War II, it's not the Holocaust, Baruch Hashem, there's lots and lots of differences, but nevertheless, missiles are getting through. And people are getting hurt, and people are dying, people are getting killed, and there's a lot of damage being done. And with these cluster bombs, it becomes more of a concern. And you have to start to wonder: is this just simply conventional warfare, or is there a deeper meaning behind all of this? This is really the main point of the Haggadah. The whole point, there's so many parts of it, but the overall overreaching message of the Haggadah is everything when it comes to Jewish history, the Jewish people, is Hashgacha Pratis. Every last detail, no matter how random or how conventional it might seem, it's happening for a reason. And if you can figure out what that reason is, then maybe you can expedite the process of tikkun by working on it on your own, not being passive in the process, and being more proactive in the process of tikkun. And we know this. How do we know this? Because we see from the past that's exactly how it worked. For example, in Mitzrayim, right? Paro, he one of the edicts was to drown not just the Jewish male children, but all male, including Egyptian, because he wasn't sure where the Moshe was going to come from. Talking about cutting off your nose to spite your face, but primarily, of course, to stop from the Jewish people. So they were drowning Jewish children. I guess there are other ways to kill somebody. Obviously, that you can kill children another way, but that was the method of choice at that point in time. And no one asked what's the Kabbalistic significance of that way of they killed the children. That's what they chose. It's not such an unusual means to do it. They built Pithom and Ramses. We built the pyramids, more than likely, right? Slave labor. And that's also normal. I mean, you're a king in a dictatorial society, and you have a slave nation at your fingertips to do whatever you want, right, at your control. And you want to build something. They're always building monuments. In those days, they were always building monuments to themselves, and all the mystical, supernatural things they like to imbue these things with. But the reality is they were just like monuments to their name and to their memory after they would die. And they would, of course, add the godly. I mean, in those days, they passed themselves off as gods, and the people believed it for whatever reason. They're very naive, and so most of the culture was built upon that. But that's what people do. That's what in the Nazis, Yamach Shema also did this, similar things. Although not as much because they were more interested in keeping them in camps and experimenting with them on them, but nothing unconventional about building in extreme conditions, not providing straw and saying that you have to go find it for yourself. You have to keep up with the quota. Nothing unusual about that. These are things that people don't question. That's why you have the Arizal. One of the reasons what the Hashem sent us the Arizal was to open Shemayim up a bit and give us a glimpse of levels of understanding that we can't get on our own. So he explains that all of the things that Paro did, I mean, in Paro's mind, I'm just being a leader doing what I want with these people, and it makes sense to me. But first of all, we have a concept that the leaders belong to Hashem. Once a person becomes a president or the leader of a country, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu works through them. They lose they almost basically lose their free will at that point. And Hashem will use them to manipulate history according to His plan. And so Paro, he thinks he's working on his own, but as HaKadosh Baruch Hu specifically doing it. Why? Because he's trying very hard to be able to accomplish a tikkun that Paro is completely unaware of, has no idea what's actually going on or why it's even going on. But as the Arizal explains, you go back to Mitzrayim, you go back to the beginning of history. After Adam Arishon, he leaves, or at least after he does the Chet. So there the Gemara says he realized his mistake, and even though he's on a lower level at that point in time, he began to focus on doing tshuva, and his tshuva took 130 years. And after that, Shais was born because he basically, he expunged himself of all the tumor from the snake and the interaction with the snake, and this was that was the part that he did on his own. But the result was that it produced shadim, and damaged souls. That's the bottom line. How? That's a process that you can look at for yourself in the Arizal. Even the Gemara itself, and Erevin on Yud Ches Amud Beis talks about it briefly. But the result was it's like someone producing soap, right? You're making soap to clean things, except unfortunately when you're making soap, there's also pollution. It goes into the back river and pollutes the river, and so the thing that's being used to make something good is actually also producing something bad. So Adam's tshuva was a good thing for him and the future of the world, but it had a negative consequence that it produced damaged souls. Now, these damaged souls actually happened to have come from the same level as Moshe Rabbeinu's soul, except the Moshe Rabbeinu's soul came through kosher and holy means. So therefore, it came undamaged. But their souls, even though they came from a very high level, they were unfortunately damaged and blemished. So they had to go through tikkun. The Arizal explains, and so the first generation they came back in human form, because at first they were just souls, and when they finally came back the first time as human beings, they came back as Dor Mabul, the generation of the flood that God wiped away because they were doing evil stuff. Even though it looks like they're getting worse, but somehow this is beginning a process of their tikkun, and by being washed away by the flood, so that was part of the tikkun process already, and then they came back as Migdal Bavel. They came back as a generation that built the Tower of Babel about 300 some odd years later, and of course they made a mistake, and Hashem didn't destroy them, but He dispersed them instead, and eventually they die off, and they keep coming back, but it's all part of this ongoing historical tikkun process that eventually they reincarnate later in history into Egypt, and the ones who were rectified, pretty much they've gone through all the necessary gilgulim and rectifications to get to where they had to get to. So they were born to Yaakov Avinu and his descendants. They were born into the Jewish people. The ones that were not fully rectified yet, but partially rectified, came back as Egyptians, who tended to gravitate towards Yaakov's family, and they eventually became the Erev Rav, the mixed multitude. But the ones who were the Jewish people, they were the closest to going out. That's why God says to Moshe, don't take the Erev Rav with you. They're not ready yet. They still need to go through another Gilgul, another reincarnation. Moshe says, boy, it's going to take too long. By the time they die and come back, it'll be forever. So let's just bring them to Mount Sinai, expose them to Torah, and hopefully that will be enough to make up for whatever they didn't accomplish by not dying. Didn't work. It didn't work. The golden calf was the result of that. We're in exile thousands of years later because of it. But that's all part of the historical process. No accidents. No accidents in Jewish history. It's all hashgacha pratis. It's all part of the master plan. But as part of the ongoing tikkun process of these souls, they had to make up for the sins of that generation too. So throwing the Jewish children into the river, the Arizal, this is not my pshat, the Arizal explains, was part of the rectification from the generation of the flood. And building Pitam and Ramses slaves was rectification for building Migdal Bavel, the Tower of Babel. And all the different things the Jewish people had to go through in the course of 116 years of slavery were all for the sake of some type of tikkun. So as random as the Yisurim, the suffering, might seem, as conventional as it might be, it's not when it comes to the Jewish people. It has to do with tikkun. Everything's about tikkun. By definition, there's nothing other than tikkun because we may have this impression that God, goes, shucks, didn't get it right. I'm moving on to someplace else. Right? I tried, didn't work. I gave them a Torah. They didn't keep it. Whatever. I'll come back and check on them later on. I'm going someplace else. I'm going to coffee break, a 3,000-year coffee break. And that's not the case. Nothing has deviated. It's not the plan that we thought. It's not the plan that we thought we're supposed to follow. I mean, from our perspective, God gave the Torah. He said, do this and don't do that. And that's, if we just stuck to the plan, then Mashiach would have been here like at Mount Sinai. Just 11 days journey from Har Sinai to Eretz Israel. And we would have been there, and Moshe would have been, Mashiach, and that would have been it. But we did the golden calf. If only we hadn't taken the Erev Rav, because without the Erev Rav, we wouldn't have done the golden calf. We would have 11 days from Mount Sinai. We wouldn't have second-guessed Moshe's arrival and saying he's coming late and he died, and all the shtuyot that came out in Parashat Kisisa. And what ifs, all the what ifs, there's no what ifs. There's no what ifs. It looks like there's what ifs. Right? If only the generations living in Europe had kept Torah mitzvahs, or enough of them had kept Torah mitzvahs, maybe a Holocaust would never happen. No, a Holocaust was nigzar. Going back to Ma'aseh Bereshit. Why? Why would God put into history such a terrible, disastrous, horrible, deadly thing? Why would he allow his children? It was actually asked recently by somebody, but doesn't God want to bring everybody back? Doesn't he want all of his children to come back to Israel at the end of days? No, not necessarily. And that's what they don't. Because if he did, they would. What about free will? They have to choose it. God's saying, come on, choose it. All right, he didn't choose it. How many people, I speak for myself personally, but how many people are living in Eretz Israel as a matter of events and background and family and history and things they saw and things they learned, that they just happened to go through all of that. They didn't always choose all of it. And that led to a perspective that said, let's make Aliyah. Let's move to Eretz Israel. And other people didn't have the same background. I mean, someone who grows up in a poor community, whose father may have left, just ran off, and the mother struggled in poverty to raise that child from nothing, and they had almost no education because of it. How can you expect them to behave on the level of somebody who grew up in comfort and had all this opportunity to learn and become educated and to put into practice their education? And who's to blame? Who's to blame? I mean, it's like, so something maybe you can, if he hadn't done that way back then, it'd be a different story today. But he did do that way back then. And if you go to way back then, I mean, how many things do we look at and say, boy, it's like going back to, to Chamberlain, who came back after the Munich conference, after meeting Yamach Shmo v'Zichro, Hitler himself, and saying, I spoke to him. He wants peace. Right? If only he hadn't done that. If only he had listened to Churchill at the beginning, right? Then maybe the Holocaust would have happened. Maybe the war wouldn't have become so big. If only the Americans hadn't been so pacifistic, That's a pacifists, whatever, pacifists, the way they were back in the early 1940s until the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and got involved in the war from the very beginning. If only, yeah, but in our world, we have if onlys. We like to entertain the possibility. What if? What if? Not in God's world. In God's world, it's always meant to be the way it is. I mean, that's part of the power of A, knowing everything before it happens, and B, having the power to manipulate every aspect of history at will. And I mean by will, just think about it. I could want to manipulate some event, but I have to somehow get involved. I have to do something, right? Not God, just have to think it, and it's already reality. And so, okay, yeah, it raises a lot of questions. All of a sudden, people go, wait, that's not what I learned. That's not the way I understood it. That's not, whoa, that's a whole different approach to history that I never even contemplated. And it changes. It's a game changer. Yeah, it's all those things. Part of the advantages of going deeper into Torah, looking at the Gemara and the Midrashim, and eventually into Kabbalah, which is really, as the Gra points out, and everybody points out, it's the soul of the body, right? All of Torah, Pshat, Remez, Drush, right? Chumash, Mishnah, Gemara, Midrashim, the Shilas of Shuvas, and all that technical halacha, all that technical knowledge that we have to be a good Jew, a good practicing Jew. Should do it for real, actually, but a good practicing Jew, right? All that is on the level of guf, the body alone. But Kabbalah, Sod, that's das. That's the soul of Torah. And all these people walking around, not for me. I don't want to do that, right? I'm not relevant. I'm not interested in that type of. Well, if you like to be a zombie, right? And you can be a zombie, by the way, without actually being one that, the classic example of a room walking around like a, it's more like a golem. You're functioning, you can think, you can act, you can even look the part, but the actual absorption of the reality of Torah, that remains on the outside. And all of a sudden, history takes a turn for the worse. Things begin to happen that we didn't anticipate, that we didn't think were possible, like October 7th, going back a couple of years, that we never crossed our mind. And how could God allow that when we're too busy asking, how could the government allow that? How could a country that has probably one of the best security systems of any country in the world, because they have to, because necessity is the mother of invention. And we have inventions because of the necessity. And you see, we've done some incredible tricky things. I mean, we hacked into the cameras in Iran, the traffic cameras, to know where all the upper government and religious leaders were going, living, and because of that, we were able to attack them and knock off most of them. That's bad. And yet October 7th, they just walk in, all these people, and take hostages and turn the country upside down for 2 years. How? So that's why people talk about conspiracies, right? How to be a conspiracy? Because there's no way, 50 years ago, 30 years ago, that was possible. Like in World War II, radar was a new thing. Before radar, you could just show up in the skies and no one knew you were coming. That's why they had spies, to find out when people were doing things so they could prepare for them. But if you didn't have that information, all of a sudden the enemy Air Force was above you, dropping bombs. Then came radar. And all of a sudden you get advanced information, you could pick it up. Right? And then we have this satellite to tell us what's going on. A missile leaves, right? We can see where it went, where it came from, and then know where to bomb. I don't know why they're still sending us these missiles, because I thought by now they're all knocked up. But apparently they have more sites and more silos and more of these bombs that do more damage. But how did it happen? Hashgacha pratis. It doesn't make a difference if there's a conspiracy. It doesn't make a difference if someone decided that had to happen for whatever reason, or they wanted to happen to dethrone Netanyahu. It doesn't matter if somebody there was nefarious reasons for what actually took place that day from our side. It will still be hashgacha pratis. In this week's parsha, right, the first word of the Torah is Vayikra. Vayikra is spelled Vav Yud Kuf Reish Aleph. But as everybody knows, as everything in the Sefer Torah, the aleph at the end of the word is small. And Rashi explains why. He brings the Medrash that says that there's a difference between the word v'yikar and v'yikra. Mikra is, an event, but it's like it's used to talk about coincidence. Even though we don't believe in coincidence per se, truly we believe in coincidence, but not random coincidence. That's a little misunderstanding people have. Coincidence just means that things coincide. In fact, a major part of miracles is the fact that they do coincide. That the natural event, actually had an experience this yesterday on the highway, that the natural event that took place, happened at the right moment to save you from something disastrous. And you could it's not like a hand came down or a voice came, I saved you, right? But when you start to think about it and consider it, you start to realize V'yikra is a word that Hashem uses for Bilam, as Rashi explains. V'yikar just means that Hashem just showed up. Like Bilam had no idea he was about to have prophecy. Bilam had no idea that God was going to speak to him. God just showed up, like like a guest, so to speak, who shows up at your front door and says, "Let's eat." Right? He didn't call for us to say he's coming, because Bilam didn't have the schus to have that sense of kavod, that Hashem had that kind of respect for him, to show him that type of respect, because it was a way of saying the prophecy you have is not because of you. You're not a prophet. I'm only giving you prophecy for the sake of the Jewish people. But Moshe Rabbeinu, Vayikra Hashem Moshe, he called him. And Rashi points out that the angels called to one another, even though the calling is a simple thing, right? But it actually is a term of chavivas. It's a term of ahava, of love. Hashem shows respect for Moshe Rabbeinu. He calls him in advance. But at the source of it, right? If you go back to Parshas B'Shalach, right, at the end where it says after the war against Amalek, and Hashem says Yad al Kes Ka, and the word Kes is really the word Kisei, missing the aleph, and Ka is Yud K, missing the Vav K. And again, Rashi explains, bringing an obscure medrash that says that it's a way of telling us that as long as Amalek is in the world, Hashem's throne will not be complete. The aleph is missing from Kisei. The aleph will not be reattached to Kisei until later on. What is that aleph? What does it really mean? That aleph is the capacity to be able to see the hand of God in your life. It's that schus, to be able to see that hashgacha pratis not 15 minutes later or not at all, as many people, I was talking to someone recently, from Chutzlarts, and they're calling to check and see how we're doing, right? And I was talking about, I was playing out the miracle aspect of it, saying how we know, as bad as the situation sounds, that if you consider how many missiles, this is before they started using the cluster bombs, you consider how many missiles have been fired at us and how many we've shot down, it's an absolute miracle. I mean, the hand of Hashem is so blatant. And the person said, "Yeah, Iron Dome is doing a great job." And then they corrected, "No, Hashem," right? But that's the point. That's V'yikar versus V'yikra. That's what the Haggadah is trying to bring out. That's what the Seder is trying to bring out. That you want to get to the level, you want to go from the level of V'yikar to V'yikra. Now, any time that you are slow to recognize the role that God has played in your Yeshua, you're acting on the level of V'yikar. But every time you see it instantaneously, right, immediately on the spot, you see, that's Hashem, that's the hand of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? Then you have moved up, you've graduated to the level of V'yikra. That's Cherus. That's where the Cherus is. You want to know how to get the Cherus, the real Cherus? So you go from there to, it sounds simple enough? It's not simple enough. So many people have not done it. So many people struggle with it. We just catch ourselves. How many times, it takes seconds or minutes before Baruch Hashem, I just realized that was such a nice, I got so distracted by the moment and the people, what's going on, right? But that's where you go to a whole different madrega, where you're walking with the Kodesh Baruch Hu like Avram Avinu did. And it's not the kind of thing you can appreciate from down here. You have to get to that level to understand what it means. It's like looking and trying to imagine what the view looks like from the top of a mountain. And as hard as you try to imagine what it must be like as you're looking up, you can see the top of the mountain. See, the same way I can see the top of a mountain, it must be kind of similar looking back down again. And then you go up there and it's like, whoa. I mean, how many times you go up in a skyscraper anywhere higher, an airplane, you look down, how long do you sit there staring at the ground, at what you see below you before you finally, tear yourself away from it? Because it's so incredibly fascinating. The view is tremendous. And that's just an analogy. The reality of walking with it, because broken that level is absolutely fantastic. So back to the original point, right? That all the things that happened to Klal Yisrael in Mitzrayim were not just Paro exercising his authority over the Jewish people. It was a Kodesh Baruch Hu using Paro as a means to prepare the Jewish people for their tikkun. Even a simple thing. This is not. I did not see this anywhere. I just happened to work on this, but it's a fascinating point to make. I've already showed you the one about Achishabita, right? About how the gematria of those two words, which describe the Guli, Achishabita means I will hasten it, Bita in its time, and how those two key words that the Gemara uses in Darshan to talk about the final redemption, how the gematria of them miraculously equals the day on which the UN decided to vote for Israel to become a state. And that may sound like tiflus. That may sound like, who cares, except for one thing. That the Vilna Gaon says very explicitly, and he stands in this point tremendously, that the Jewish people don't merit to get Eretz Yisrael because of their Torah and their mitzvahs. It has to come from the reshus of the nations of the world, he says. And he brings as the example is Koresh. It was Koresh who Hashem used back at the time of Persia to allow the Jews to go back. He had to get permission. Hashem could have bent his will, could have said, could have crushed them. He didn't. Instead, he worked through Koresh, Cyrus, right? And told him in his head, he didn't know it was coming from God. He just felt this urge to do it. So he told the Jewish people, yeah, you can go back and build the base of Mikdash and go back to Israel. Not everyone went, but he gave permission. So the Gra says, yeah, that's how it happens when it comes to B'derech Small, as opposed to Derech Yamin, which is Rachamim. Derech Small is din, is judgment. So therefore, it has to happen through the technical means of the world. So as the Brisker Rab pointed out, that for all we know, right, Rav Soloveitchik, that the UN only came to existence for that one vote. That was the only purpose. It's still here, but that was the most important vote, to vote on that. And even the vote itself was miraculous, because you take into account all the hashgacha pratis surrounding the whole vote, with Truman getting to power in Roosevelt's fourth term, the last president to have 4 terms. After that, went to 2 terms, and he dropped his running mate from the previous 3 terms of the 4th term, and Truman happened to be a Bible wielding president who believed in the prophecies of the Torah, if you can imagine that, at that time, and he believed that the Jewish people going back to their land was the fulfillment of prophecy from Deuteronomy, right, from Parashat Kisavo and Devarim. He really believed it. He says he's quoted as saying these things. And one of the most impactful days of his entire life, he wrote, it was written about his in a biography, that when after he was out of office and Chief Rabbi Goren came to visit him to thank him for his influence and his participation in the vote in the UN that Israel should become an accepted homeland, he said to him, "You're like Cyrus in your generation." And Truman knew exactly who Cyrus was, and he was so taken by that he could have such a biblical role in history. He began to cry, and he said, "You really believe so, Rabbi?" He says, "Yep. You have a special place in heaven for what you did over there." I mean, the Eshkacha Pratis is unbelievable, and this is really what it comes down to, being able to see. Right, the hand of Hashem. The Gemara in Sanhedrin, also in Kesuvos, it also shows up first in Kesuvos. I believe it's in Lamed Amud Aleph there, talking about the Arba Misas based in the 4 different ways mentioned in our Vidui on Yom Kippur. Right, the 4 different ways that the based in executed a person who was guilty of capital punishment. Each one is prescribed by the Torah for specific sins. For skila, for example, which is stoning, but contrary to popular thought that skila is not about standing against the wall and people pelting you with stones. It's about being up on a two-story platform and then being pushed off after drinking some wine so you don't know what's happening, and then falling to the ground, breaking their neck, right? And that's why some people have a minhag when they make kiddush right before they the savrim or none. L'chaim, they say, right? Why they throw a l'chaim there? What's l'chaim? And anytime we say l'chaim, by the way, because since the wine was used to kind of drug the guilty person who was about to get killed, so he wouldn't have to suffer the knowledge of what he's going down through, that we say that this drink should be for life. That was for death. This is for life. That's what people throw it in. Right? And then after he didn't die, so they put a stone on top, and that's why it's called stoning. Then you have sreifa, burning, and you have sayev, which is a sword cutting off the head. Nice, happy things to talk about, but it's part of the point, right? And of course, you have strangulation, which is also quite a not nice to talk about. The Gemara says, once the Sanhedrin was batel, these were batel too. They were also batel. In other words, they stopped. We can't do it anymore. There's no Sanhedrin who can paskin, and even if there was a Sanhedrin, I think there is a Sanhedrin. They put together one, but there's no authority to actually make. You have to get smicha, the real smicha, not the kind where you get tested in Mishnah Berurah and Gemara and things like that. And the rabbi, I said, document says, how you're a rabbi now, right? Where they put their hands on the person, they pass through them, certain ruach, going back to Moshe Rabbeinu. And because of that, we can't do the capital punishment. That's why, well, I won't go into that in public here because that can be controversial. But regardless, the point being that the Gemara does say in the end that even though the Sanhedrin cannot give out those punishments anymore because they don't exist and they have no authority, a person can still die by them. So, for example, if a person is chayiv skila, then that could be, for example, breaking Shabbos. A person deliberately breaks Shabbos, they're from, right? They know, or at least they know Torah mitzvahs. They know that God exists. They know that the Torah came from God, and yet they're still breaking Shabbos. Not they didn't. We're interested. They're not, disbelievers. They're not at that stage yet. They know, but this person, he knows that God said, and these two witnesses say, you do that on Shabbos, you're going to be guilty of the death penalty. He goes, I don't care. He does it anyhow, right? And they see him. The same witnesses. It's not so easy to give skila. Not so easy to get the death penalty. So the Gemara says he'll fall off a roof. Such a person will find themselves in some place where they can fall and have a similar type of death as they would if the Beis Din were to carry it out. Someone chayav sreifa, burning for a specific type of sin, they'll burn somehow. People burn. There's all kinds of fires that happen. Strangulation, the person can drown instead. The point I'm making is not about being gruesome over here. The point I'm making is you have to understand that no matter what happens, a cluster bomb comes flying over Israel, breaks into pieces, and falls over here. By the way, back in the time of the Ani Akava, they should have named the Iron Dome Ani Akava. That would have been better. And maybe it'd be more protective if they did. That would be a real direct acknowledgement to Kosh Baruch Hu, right? Because that's what the Ani Akava did. It says the daytime and nighttime, right? They used to send missiles, blistering, to send missiles at the Jewish people, and the Ani Akava would grab them, would stop them, would prevent them from getting through and affecting the Jewish people. So missiles and things like that, it's not new. The Romans, they had these big, huge rocks and things like that. They used to catapults and throw them. But I don't know the Kabbalistic basis yet, working in it still, the Kabbalistic basis of why this particular thing is happening this particular way and having this particular impact on these particular people. That's information that you at a very high level, and maybe like a Moshe Rabbeinu type level, to know such specifics. But I do know that whatever it is we're going through, even though it's conventional warfare, that's what they have. That's what they bought. That's what countries use today. Nothing unusual. You want to go to war against a country, that's what they're going to send at you. Doesn't make a difference. It could have been, HaKadosh Baruch Hu could have put into the minds of the developers 100 years ago and say, make a missile like this because at night in 2026, under the war between Iran and the Jewish people, we will use this because the tikkun necessary for the final redemption will come through this particular thing because it's that way in the spheres. It's that way in the spiritual realm. It's interesting. There are two words for straw. There's kash and there's tevin, right? In the Torah, these is tevin. Rashi brings down the words, kash, straw. Yeah, Esav is compared to kash. He's called straw by the Navi. The Jewish people were made to go look for it. Paro said, "Oh, you got time to fetch? You got time to listen to Moshe Rabbeinu?" He didn't say Rabbeinu, right? But Moshe, or whatever they called him in Egypt, you have time to do that? I'll tell you what, so here, to take care of your spare time, I'm going to take away all the straw and make you go looking for it and tell you that anybody who falls short in the quota of bricks is going to pay. That's not fair. Of course it's not fair. Well, that's just cruel. Of course it's cruel. And so Moshe says to God, what did you do? You sent me down to Mitzrayim to save the Jewish people. This is not redemption. And God doesn't say, you're right, we're not there yet. We'll just get a few more moments and we'll get. He says, yes, this is redemption. This is, unfortunately, part of the redemption process. You need an operation. There's pre-surgery. There's things you have to go through. You might, it might be painful. Some of the things you have to do in advance. Most are taking off the bandages after. But he censors Moshe, for that. He says, in the contrary, this is in fact part of the Gula process. But the gematria of Kash, interesting enough, is 400, right? Shin is 300, Kuf is 100, 400. The amount of time the Jewish people supposedly were supposed to be in a land not their own. 400, just like that. So in a sense, they're leaving early, 190 years early. The gematria of Ketz Yamim, that's why we're making it up later on by the end of days, right? And how do we accelerate the process? By increasing the slavery, but specifically increasing the slavery by making them go look for 400s. The 400 years, somehow by doing that, it makes up for whatever effect the other 190 years we're supposed to have as part of the preparation process. The other word for straw is tevin, as the Torah uses, it calls it tevin. And there the gematria is 452. And if you add the two together, you get 852, which is very coincidental. I'll tell you why it's very coincidental, in a good way, in a shkachatich way, right? Because 852 is also a famous number. It's the number that the Torah says in Parshas Veschanan, where God uses the word v'nishantam. You will come into the land and you'll dwell in the land for many years. And the word v'nishantam means like go old. You'll be there like from the word yashan, old, for many years. And Rashi brings on the measures on that word. We wouldn't stop and say anything about that word. Rashi stops and says the Gemara. The Gemara is what talks about it and brings down the gematria v'nishantam is 852. That's interesting. So what's the significance of the number? So it says that in the pasuk, then eventually you'll forget about me, and then I'm going to obliterate you. I'm going to destroy you. So the Medrash says, well, the Gemara Gerata, Medrash says that Hashem exiled us after 850 years, 2 years earlier than was prophesied by Vishnantam, to save us from being obliterated like the pasuk talks about, to not allow us to go to the full extent of becoming destroyable. So therefore he preempted that disastrous conclusion by sending us into exile 2 years earlier, whatever that means. It's all hashgacha pratis. There's no such thing as early or late by God. It's all the same thing. So the point being, is that when you look into the sky or you look at these videos and you see what's going on and you watch the missiles and you watch them being counterattacked and being shot down, right? And you see these clusters, whatever the enemy is throwing at us, whether it's physically, whether it's verbally, it's not random. It's all part of some type of tikkun process. And if you say, what about October 7th? Is that much different than what happened in Mitzrayim? with throwing babies into the sea, the type of brutal treatment that the Jews got while they're in Egypt, being beaten to death. This, you want to ask God, why is that necessary? Everybody has that question. Why is it? It's not just about a creation where God says you behave yourself, none of the bad stuff happens. Yeah, you must have Mashiach. Until then, says Kabbalah, no, that's history. Why? Okay, good question. We don't really have the answer right now. I mean, we do have the answer. I mean, the Gra talks about that. We know the specifics about what our history is built from and why it necessitates all the things that we go through. But why did it have to be that way? That history is built that way, and therefore, these are all interesting questions. But the bottom line is that we're talking about God and His master plan, and He's not one of us. He's not even close to being one of us. We're so different from. We're so limited compared to Him. He's got things in mind. He's so far advanced. He's so otherworldly. It's like, I don't even have the words to describe him. So as much as he's told us about this world and about history and about what we've gone through, we're going to, what has to accomplish, still just a fraction. We need to know to fully understand everything. But he has our back, meaning that everything that happens to the Jewish people in any way, whatever we go through, is by definition part of the redemption process. It's for the good. It's not comfortable. It's not what we would choose for ourselves. We'd just like to sail off into the sunset, right? Already. We're enough. We've had enough. Just bring the Mashiach already. Yeah, I mean, that's the way we feel. But God says, yeah, but that's not the ultimate. You'll thank me one day. You'll see why it was all important, every last aspect of it. But in the meantime, right, think about it, right? Work on being part of the Vayikra club, not the Vikar club. Work on seeing, don't get distracted. It's an extremely distracting world. Amalek's number one methodology for getting a Jew is distraction away from the truth. Go past it. See the hand of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in everything, every aspect on the spot, every moment of it. That itself is a tikkun. That's all Hashem is doing in the end. I mean, it's been thousands of years since the Bible, right, since Tanakh ruled the world in an obvious way. It's always behind the scenes making it all happen. It's really the puppeteer making everything dance down here. People think that they're in control. They're not in control. But it's reintroducing itself back into history. And step by step, it's doing that through the events of the day. But if we preempt it, then that too will be hashgacha pratis. We won't do it if we're not meant to. But if we're meant to, it means that we can. So do it, get the aleph, become a full adam, and experience the cherus promised to us at this time of year. Have a good Shabbos.